The cerebral nuclei are also called basal nuclei, and they're paired irregular masses of gray matter that are deep within the white matter. Now, these several structures include the caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus, the claustrum, and the amygdaloid body. So you can see some of them here as illustrated on the image. Now, these nuclei, nucleus normally, have heard this before, was the nucleus of a cell where the DNA is located. This is not the same thing. These are collections of cells located within the brain. Now, the cerebral nuclei are going to help regulate motor output, help inhibit unwanted movements. So they sort of help to filter out incorrect or inappropriate responses and help to select the best response to be processed by the cortex. A headache is a brain disorder that is due to dilated blood vessels in the skull or due to muscle contraction. The muscle contraction component happens very frequently when people are staring at a computer too long, and the eye movement, the eye strain that is associated with that eye movement. Migraine headaches are severe recurring headaches that usually affect only one side of the head, and the headaches are not a brain disorder, but sometimes they do accompany more serious disorders or diseases. Cerebral palsy is a group of neuromuscular disorders that usually result from damage to an infant's brain before, during, or immediately after birth. There are 3 types of CP that involve impairment of skeletal muscle activity to some degree. Huntington disease is a hereditary disease. It affects the cerebral nuclei, and it causes rapid, jerky, involuntary movements that usually start on one side in the face, but over months and years tends to progress to the arms and legs as well. Progressive intellectual deterioration also occurs, including personality changes, memory loss, and irritability. The disease has an average age of onset in the mid-30s to 40s and is usually fatal within 10 to 20 years. Parkinson's disease, is a brain disorder that results from the degeneration or breaking down of the dopamine-releasing neurons. Patients typically will exhibit a stiff posture, expressionless face, slow voluntary movements, and tremors, especially in the hands, and sometimes a shuffling gait. This is caused by that deficiency of dopamine and results in the degeneration and decreased production of the dopamine neurons, especially in one of the nuclei in the brain called the substantia nigra. The dopamine deficiency prevents brain cells from inhibiting the cerebral nuclei that control movement, so you have that uncontrollable movement. By the time the symptoms develop, the person's typically lost about 80 to 90% of the dopamine producing cells. So the best treatment currently for that is to give medications that increase the dopamine. Now we'll look at another major brain area, and that is the diencephalon, which is sandwiched between the cerebral hemispheres, and therefore it's sometimes called the in-between brain because it's in between the 2 cerebral hemispheres. The cavity or the space included in the diencephalon is the 3rd ventricle, and the diencephalon itself has 3 major components: the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. So before we talk about the epithalamus, let's look at these areas. So this little oval-shaped structure right here is the thalamus. Hypo means below, so this area is the hypothalamus, and then this area right here is the epithalamus. So we'll begin with the epithalamus, which is sort of the roof of the 3rd ventricle. It contains the pineal gland, which is a part of the endocrine system, and it secretes a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin is responsible for our day-night cycles, known as our circadian rhythm, and it helps to regulate our sleep-wake cycle. So when it is dark, we release more melatonin, and that is supposed to make us sleepy. In addition to that, there are nuclei that are going to relay signals from the limbic system to the midbrain. This is also involved in visceral and emotional response to odors. For instance, if you smell something and it makes you happy, makes you think of Granny's apple pie, well, that is being processed in the nucleus of the epithalamus. If you have something that when you smell it, it makes you nauseous, that is a visceral reaction to that smell. And of course, that is processed in the epithalamus as well. The thalamus is the second part of the diencephalon we'll look at. It actually makes up about 80% of the entire diencephalon. So it's two large oval masses of gray material that are connected with an interthalamic adhesion, which is just a little bit of gray matter that connects the right and left lobes of the thalamus. So the third ventricle actually sits here in the space between them, and that is, of course, because it's a ventricle, it's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So the thalamus receives signals from all of the conscious senses except olfaction, the sense of smell. But it does have a very crude recognition of a stimulus as pleasant or unpleasant. It also helps us to send signals to the appropriate part of the cortex. So when the information comes in, the thalamus works like a relay station to send that information to the appropriate part of the cortex. In addition to that, it helps to filter out signals that really don't need our attention, such as all the background noise in a crowded room, or the noise of the traffic going down the road outside your bedroom window, or the ceiling fan as you are trying to study. So things that don't need attention get filtered out. And right here we have the hypothalamus, which makes up, if you will, the floor of the third ventricle. Because remember, all of this is going to be filled with fluid between the right and left sides. So you're looking at the right hemisphere. All of this would also be in the left hemisphere, connected by that little interthalamic adhesion and the corpus callosum. Now, there are many nuclei within the hypothalamus, and it is connected to the pituitary gland by a little stalk-like structure called the infundibulum. Within that infundibulum, we have blood vessels and axons of nerves that connect the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus has numerous functions, including control of the autonomic nervous system that influences your heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, and respiration. It also controls the endocrine system because it makes and releases hormones that control the activity of the anterior pituitary. In addition to that, it releases hormones or produces hormones called antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin that are stored in the posterior part of the pituitary and then released. The hypothalamus works to help regulate our sleep-wake cycles, our body temperature, whether or not we're eating or drinking. So the hypothalamus, of course, is basically a large control center because it does regulate so much. At one time, it was thought the pituitary gland was the master gland until scientists finally realized the master has a master, and that is the hypothalamus. In addition to everything else, it helps to regulate emotional behavior. As a part of the limbic system, it controls emotional responses. Now, the hypothalamus is the last brain area to develop in a baby, so premature babies can't regulate their body temperature well, so that's why we keep them wrapped up in blankets. The next area of the brain we'll look at is the brain stem. So it connects the cerebrum, the diencephalon, and the cerebellum to the spinal cord. The spinal cord is simply a continuation of the brain stem. The brain stem contains ascending and descending tracts, so information coming in, ascending, information going out, descending. It has autonomic nuclei, the nuclei of the cranial nerves and reflex centers. We'll look at a bit of this. So it consists of three major areas: the midbrain, which you see right here, the pons, which is this little oval enlarged area, and the medulla oblongata. All right, this area right here is the midbrain, and it carries voluntary motor commands from the primary motor cortex to the cerebellum and to the spinal cord. In addition to that, you have this little area right here In a lot of our brain models, this actually looks sort of like a little pregnant lady with the breast here and an extended, distended abdomen down here. Now, because there are 4 of those, 2 on each side, we call those sometimes the, I'm sorry, I just totally lost my thought there for a moment. The corpora quadragemina. 4 corpora, quadra, 4, okay, corpora, body. Now, those actually help to process auditory and visual stimuli as reflexes. So think about it, if a car pulls out in front of you and you are looking at your phone and you look up and there's that car, you have a visual startle reflex, right? And auditory reflex, if you hear a loud noise behind you, you jerk around to look at that. Well, that is processed in those corpora quadragemina, which have that reflexive action to cause you to act quickly and unpredictably to that stimulus. And next we have the pons, which is the contains the pneumotaxic center. Pneumo always refers to breathing. So this area helps us to maintain the rhythm of our normal breathing. It includes sensory and motor tracts that connect the brain to the spinal cord, and it also is a relay station, very much like the thalamus. It relays impulses from the voluntary skeletal muscle, or to the skeletal muscle, from the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And the medulla oblongata is the inferior part of the brainstem that is continuous with the spinal cord. There are bulgy areas called pyramids, and these are where the motor cortex neurons cross over. Within the medulla, we have a cardiovascular center that has 2 areas. The cardiac center can modify the force and rate of contraction. The vasomotor center, vaso means vascular, so the vasomotor center regulates the diameter of the blood vessels to help control blood pressure. There's also a respiratory group here in the medulla, and that's your medullary respiratory group or center. It helps to generate your respiratory rhythm, causing you to breathe more quickly when you need to get more oxygen in and more slowly when you don't. So it controls the rate and depth of your breathing. And it also helps to regulate, processing stimuli that cause vomiting and other reflexive actions such as hiccuping, swallowing, which we do control, coughing, and sneezing. All right, remember that 3rd ventricle was up here at the hypothalamus and thalamus area, so they're in the diencephalon. And then we have this little structure called the cerebral aqueduct that the cerebrospinal fluid flows through on its way to the 4th ventricle. Excuse me, it snuck up on me. I talked about sneezing on the last slide there. So this little enlarged area right here, which is between the 2 halves of the cerebellum, is the 4th ventricle, and then it continues down through the brainstem and all the way through to become the central canal of the spinal cord to carry that CSF down into the spinal cord as well.